In today's episode, we're going back down to the Outer Banks again. But this will be the last time for a while. I need to show some love to the rest of North Carolina. But today we're going to be talking about a witch, or a possible witch, or maybe just a case of hysteria. But in this episode, I'm going to tell you about the Cora tree. Welcome to the NC Everything podcast. I'm your host, Curtis, and this is the bi-weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. And this is episode 98 of the show. I think it's 98. But anyway, if you're new to the show, welcome. And if you're returning, welcome to episode, I think, 98. I got a really cool story for you today. I've been wanting to cover, witch trials in North Carolina. And North Carolina did have some witch trials, not like as bad as up north. But I'm having trouble finding a lot of information on the actual witches in North Carolina or possible witches or witch trials. So I was really happy that Matt from Cherokee suggested the Cora tree. And you'll see how that relates to witches as we go along. But first, as always, if you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe, or subscribe, rate, and review. And you can join the Facebook group by searching the NC Everything Podcast on Facebook. And you can visit the website at www.thencEverythingpodcast.com. There you can contact me and you can make a suggestion for an episode. And please don't let it be the Outer Banks for a little while. I've been hitting the Outer Banks really hard here lately. And if you're watching on YouTube and you'd like to listen, I can be found on most podcast players. And if you're listening and you'd like to watch on YouTube, well, I have a YouTube link in the description below. And I have a link for the website and the Facebook group and the contact button all down below. For those of you who have made suggestions, I did switch over to bi-weekly, and I have a lot of suggestions. I'm only doing suggestions for a while until I get a bunch of them knocked out. So if you've made a suggestion recently, unfortunately, it could be a few months out. But I promise you, it's on the list. I've most likely already started the research for it. And so, Christian from work, you made a suggestion the other night, about another murder case in North Carolina. And I've already started researching that one, but again, it's going to be a few months out. I have I think 10 or 12 episodes planned out that are suggestions, and I'm taking care of them kind of in the order they come. So if you have made a suggestion, just be patient. If you're worried about it or you're interested when it might be coming out, reach out to me and I'll be happy to tell you. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. Again, this was suggested by Matt from Cherokee, and we're going back down to Hatteras to talk about a place called Frisco and a lady named Cora. Now, I want to tell you right away, if you're watching on YouTube, it's pretty windy out today, so hopefully the microphone's not going to pick up too much of that. We'll see. I'm in my welding shop, as you can see, and I have stuff hanging around outside, and some of it's kind of banging on the building from the wind. Now, as far as the story goes, a lot of it is legend, and I don't mind. I like legends, but a lot of it can't be verified, but it's still a great story. And there's some actual evidence of the story, or actual evidence of Cora toward the end in the existence of the Cora tree. But I don't want to jump ahead, so let's start out. According to legend, it was the early 1700s when Cora showed up in the Outer Banks with her baby. And I don't have any last name for Cora. Well, nobody seemed to know where this lady came from, and she barely spoke to anybody anyway, but she had this baby with her all the time. And right away, of course, she's going to have the baby with her all the time. There's no mention of any mate with her, any husband, any man. So if it's just her and the baby's going to be with her all the time. Well, she came into the village, and they already thought she was kind of strange because she didn't speak to anybody. Well, then she decided to settle down, and instead of trying to find a spot in the village, she went outside the village, out, I guess on the outskirts, you would say, and she built a small hut for shelter. And it wasn't nothing fancy as you would see in the village. It was, what I understand, just logs and debris kind of stacked up to keep her out of the weather. And that's how she started out her existence in this little village. So imagine this mysterious woman and her baby just appear pretty much out of nowhere without a husband. She doesn't really speak to anybody. And instead of joining the group, she finds an isolated spot to build a barely standing hut outside of town or outside of the village. Now imagine that it's the 18th century. So you know what that means. She's a witch. I mean, she just has to be. Keep in mind, the Salem witch trials were in 1692, so they weren't that long ago. And even though lightning fast communication was still a few years out, word had surely gotten down to the Carolinas about the witches that were now in the New World. Eventually, like in most cases, the whole village was convinced that Cora was a witch. And you know how it goes. One person thinks she's kind of strange, then a few people start thinking she's kind of an oddball. Then someone mentions witch, then people start seeing things, and then everybody grabs their torches and pitchforks. In the case of Cora, one of the things that the villagers saw was Cora touching a cow. And that was it. She touched a cow. But according to the villagers, a few days after Cora was seen touching the cow, her udders dried up. The cow's udders dried up. And she stopped making milk. On another occasion, one of the young boys in the village was making ugly faces at Cora's baby. And it wasn't long after that, the boy got sick as a dog. So obviously, Cora had cursed the young fella. Then there was the whole fish problem. And if you know anything about the Outer Banks, they survive off fish down there. It's all through there is fish. So they had a fish problem. All of a sudden, the fishermen who had been catching plenty of fish couldn't catch a single one. Yet Cora, who was never seen fishing, had plenty to eat. Now, I suspect it was around this time that the village people began to pray and look for answers to their witch problem. And then suddenly, not by any sort of magic or sorcery, a ship showed up in the village. This ship was the Susan G, and it was beat up and worn out from being on the sea. So the Susan G is in dire need of some repairs, and so they stop at the village. On board the Susan G was Captain Eli Blood and his crew. Lo and behold, Captain Eli wasn't just any old captain. He was a native of Salem, Massachusetts. And not only was he a native of Salem, but he was also a renowned witch hunter. Well, once old Captain Blood heard that the village had a witch on their hands, he set up shop. Besides, he had to wait around for the owner of the ship to send money so they could repair the ship anyway, so he figured he'd do some witch hunting while he was there. He declared that he could, should, and would defend the poor people from the evil witch, and he set out to do just that. So he goes around the village declaring his plan about, catching this witch, and he's scooping up every bit of gossip he could get about this Cora woman. And the villagers, they blamed every inconvenience they had on Cora. Now, just in case Captain Blood wasn't yet convinced that there was a witch amongst them, one day a body suddenly just washes up the shore. It was a local villager, and though he was good and dead, he had a look of absolute terror on his face. His hands were clasped together as if he died during prayer, and carved right into his forehead were the numbers 666. You could speculate that this was the work of Cora the witch, but once the villagers saw the small, tiny little ladylike footprints all around the body that led off into the direction of Cora's hut, well, they knew what had happened to this poor soul. It was such a fortunate turn of events that a tried and true witch hunter from Salem just happened to be on scene. So he knew how to hunt down witches, which he didn't have to do, I guess, because they knew where she lived. But he also knew what tests to administer to make sure they were actually a witch. So Captain Blood, he gets together the bravest and nosiest of the villagers, and they head for Cora's shack. Cora, of course, was inside minding her own business when Captain Blood busts down the door, and he grabs her and her baby, and they're dragged out into the middle of the village for testing. Now, I'll tell you right here, before we get into it, nothing really happened to the baby. They didn't hurt the child, if this story is true. But a lot of people in the village were convinced that the baby was actually Cora's familiar. And if you're not familiar with witch lore, witches have black cats. Well, witches take on a familiar. It's, I'm not sure the whole tool of a familiar, but it's the essence of a black cat. For Cora, instead of a black cat, she had a baby. All right, so let's start testing. The first test was to cut Cora's hair. If her hair can be cut, she's just a strange woman who wants to be left alone. But if her hair can't be cut, she's a witch. So Blood pulls out his knife and he starts slashing away at Cora's hair. And not a strand was cut. His knife had no effect on her hair whatsoever. 1 point for Captain Blood. Next, he ties her hands and feet up and throws her into the sea. And you guys know this one. A sinker means that she's just a drowned woman, and a floater means that she was a witch. And of course, Cora floated. Now was the last and most complex test. Captain Blood takes out his ceremonial witch hunting bowl, and it's a good thing he remembered to bring it. He fills the bowl with water and pokes his finger with a knife. He waits until a drop of his blood falls into the water. Then he chose 3 other men from the crowd and made them perform the same routine. Once there were 4 drops of man blood in the water, Captain Blood stirred the water, and then he and the other 3 finger-poked villagers looked at the surface to see what they could see. Yep, there were 2 faces showing in the bowl. One was Cora's, and the other one was the face of Satan himself. Case closed as far as Captain Blood was concerned, so he drags Cora and the baby to an oak tree in the middle of town and ties them to the trunk, which I thought he took them to the middle of town for the testing, so maybe this is the middle of town where this tree was located. Once Cora was good and secure to the tree, Captain Blood and the villagers set off to gather some firewood so they could burn the witch alive, because everybody knows the only way to kill a witch is to burn her alive. I mean, besides hanging, obviously. I guess Blood forgot about the time in Massachusetts where they were hanging witches. Well, the firewood was piled up around Cora, and Captain Blood lit a torch. He started making his way over to the pile of wood so he could burn the witch, but then he started hearing some complaints. Captain Thomas Smith was the spokesman for the complainers. He told Blood that this wasn't right. Captain Smith felt like Cora should be taken to the mainland and tried in a court of law like everybody else. Well, an argument breaks out between Blood and Smith, and while they argued, they didn't notice the dark clouds that were rolling in. Eventually, Captain Blood, he's tired of arguing. He's got his torch in his hand so he can burn Cora. But just then, lightning comes out of the clouds and it strikes the tree with a huge thunder boom. It was so powerful that it knocked all the nosy bystanders on the ground. Well, once everybody got back on their feet and they looked at the tree where Cora was tied, they were in disbelief. Through the smoke from the burnt tree, they could see that Cora and the baby were gone, vanished. The ropes were still there, the firewood was still there, but no witch and no baby. There was now a large heart-shaped hole in the tree, and on the exact spot where Cora was tied to the tree, there were 4 large letters burnt into the tree trunk. C-O-R-A. And that's the legend of the Cora tree. But is it just a legend? I can't really tell you whether or not this Cora woman actually existed, and if she did, whether she was a witch or not. But I can tell you that the Cora tree is real. And Nicholas, you know who you are. Shame on you for not mentioning the Cora tree when you sent me and my family to the Outer Banks. That would have been really awesome. Unless you didn't know about it either. And in that case, let's see who gets there first. But yes, the Cora tree is real, and you can go see it in all of its glory right now, including the name Cora. It's located at 50175 Snug Harbor Drive in the Brigand Bay community in Frisco. You can also save yourself some gas and click the link in the description. I'll post a picture of the Cora tree. Now, let's see if we can debunk the legend, or prove it, or at least explain the tree in question. So, the tree that is supposed to be the Cora tree, the one that you'll find in Frisco, is a live oak. I read that live oaks grow pretty fast until they get about 70 years old. Then they slow way down because the tree trunks have gotten as big as they'll ever be. But they still live a really long time after that. Some of the oldest living live oaks are 1,000 years old. Now, you may think that even if the carving was there in the early 1700s, it should be gone by now through aging of the tree, but you would be wrong. Apparently, when a tree grows, most of the growth is in the branches and the uppermost part of the trunk. So if the carving was done on the trunk and not a branch, then scientifically, there's no reason to think that the word Cora in the tree could be visible for 100 years yet. But there is another possibility I like for the Cora tree, and that's the lost colonist. If you don't know the story of the lost colonist of Roanoke, go listen to episode 66 of the show on Sir Walter Raleigh. If you do know the story, then you know all about the word Croatan carved into a tree where the Roanoke colony was. Also, on the actual fort of the Roanoke colony, there was said to be a post with the word Crow carved into it. It was like they were in the process of writing the word Croatan, and they just gave up or got interrupted. Then, down there in Frisco, you got Cora carved into an oak tree. You can already see the similarities. Here's another thing. Croatan, Crow, and Cora were all carved at the same exact height from the ground, 5 feet. And the letters in all three carvings were said to be the same size, 4 inches tall, all capital letters. Now, we don't know exactly what happened to the lost colonists, although there's some pretty logical theories. One such theory is that they migrated for survival. Some experts believe that they left markers along the way so that they could be found if anybody was looking for them. And no, I'm not going to talk about the Dare Stones right now. Maybe one day. If you're curious about the Dare Stones, you can look them up, but I don't think there's not really a whole lot of merit to it, I don't think. Anyway, the carving of the word Croatan and its variations may have been a way to kind of mark where they were going. And I do admit that it's not very efficient if you were banking on someone finding you in the vast wilderness of 16th century North Carolina. I mean, there's got to be just trees everywhere, and you're hoping they'll find this one tree that you carved something in. But I'm not done yet. It's 1588. The colonists, we'll say they went to the Croatan Indian village in search of better conditions and possibly a rescue. There's 2 archaeological sites in this Indian village, one at Cape Creek in Buxton and another at Frisco. And most people believe that if the colonists went anywhere, they would have most likely went over to the natives living on Hatteras Island, which is where Frisco happens to be. Then there's the case of the coins and counters. You already know what coins are, but counters are an old way of figuring out math. Think of like a 16th century calculator. So the way you make a counter is with some soft metal and a hammer and a die. Well, guess what? They have found some counters just like this in Frisco, and they look just like the counters that have been recovered at the Roanoke site. It says that they have all the same markings and designs and even have the same flaws on them, which would indicate that they were most likely made by the same die. So one can at least assume that the lost colonists ended up in Hatteras at some point. So maybe this carving Cora in the tree, maybe it was a lost colonist. But let's go back to the witch story for just a few minutes before I wrap up. You remember that we had Cora with no known last name, we had Captain Blood who arrived on a ship named the Susan G, and we had Captain Thomas Smith. Well, there's no record of any of these people or this ship ever existing. I also read that the name Cora wasn't even very popular in the 18th century. You know when it did become popular? In the 1900s. In regards to Captain Blood, 1, how is history going to forget a man with a name like that? Captain Blood. 2, we know everything about the Salem witch trials, but we lost track of a witch hunter? It really doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about all the facts from colonial history that we did hold on to, but we lost track of a witch hunter named Captain Blood. Now we got the Susan G. And again, there's no record of the Susan G. We know the names of the ships in Christopher Columbus's fleet, and we know the names of the ships that brought the Pilgrims here. We know the names of the ships that brought the Jamestown colonists here, but we forgot to record the ship belonging to a witch hunter from Salem, Massachusetts. It just doesn't make any sense. Now, we'll say that one of the ships that was used in the Jamestown expedition was called the Susan Constant. It wasn't the Susan G, but it does kind of make you wonder. So here's my theories. I think that the name Cora was already carved into this tree before the village became populated. Maybe by the lost colonists, who knows. But as the village became more and more populated and people started seeing this, Cora carved into this eerie old tree, rumors and legends started filling in the unknown gaps of knowledge around the carving. And now you have the story I just told. Or maybe a lady was murdered down there and they all cried witch to kind of justify what they had done. And someone who actually cared for this woman carved her name into the tree, kind of like a memorial. Personally, I kind of hope Cora was a witch and she used her sorcery to escape what would have been a really horrible fate. She ran off somewhere and raised her child in peace and never had to use her powers to harm another soul. But that's the Cora tree, folks. I hope you enjoyed the story. I sure like putting it together, and you better believe the next time I get to the Outer Banks, I'm going to be looking for this Cora tree. Now, I know that was probably, I'm still recording, but I'm sure this is going to be a shorter episode. But it was fun doing a legend. I've covered some ghost stories, but I hadn't done a whole lot of legends, and I haven't done any witches really. I think I might have mentioned in the Salem episode, or Old Salem in North Carolina, I might have mentioned the three witches in the George Washington story, but that's where there were supposedly three witches living in a in a tunnel or in a cave outside of Winston Salem or outside of Salem. And George Washington comes to town. He hears about the witches. Nobody knows what happened, but George Washington went to visit these three witches, and then they were never seen again. But anyway, that's really all I got. Again, thank you, Matt from Cherokee, for suggesting that episode. And if you liked the episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Subscribe, rate, and review. I keep getting that mixed up. Check us out on Facebook for extra NC Everything content. Check out the YouTube page or listen to me on a podcast player. And hit the contact button if you have an idea for an episode. And I think I got everything covered, so I'll talk to you in a couple weeks.